Have you ever noticed how strange the way money messes with our heads is? Because, in theory, getting off zero should bring relief. But in practice, many people feel exactly the opposite. When your account is at zero, there isn't much to lose. When you manage to save a little, any unexpected expense turns into a huge threat. That's when fear starts living in your head. You look at the balance and think, what if I lose this too? What if everything goes wrong again? What if this money disappears the same way it always does? This anxiety doesn't show up when you're at rock bottom. It shows up when you start climbing. And that confuses everyone because nobody talks about it. Everyone sells the idea that saving money brings peace. But nobody warns you that before peace comes a period of absurd tension, a period where you sleep poorly. Check your account all the time. Do mental math all day. And live with the constant feeling that something bad is going to happen just to test you. Maybe you're exactly at that point right now. Not completely broke, but far from feeling safe. You're no longer at absolute zero, but you don't feel any freedom either. On the contrary, it feels like now you have something to lose, and that weighs more than having nothing. It's like walking while holding a glass filled to the brim. Before, without the glass, you walked calmly. Now, every step is tense. Every expense brings guilt. Every desire becomes an internal conflict. Buying something simple makes you feel irresponsible. Not buying it makes you feel trapped. And in the middle of all this, the money that was supposed to help starts becoming a constant source of stress. The problem is that no one explains to you that there is an emotional threshold with money, a specific point where the brain changes how it behaves. Below that point, your mind is in survival mode. You don't think clearly, you react. Any unexpected expense turns into panic. Any bad news becomes a disaster. You don't make decisions, you put out fires. And the cruelest part is that it doesn't matter if you earn little or a lot. If you're below that threshold, the internal feeling is the same. Constant insecurity, mental exhaustion, fear of the future, the feeling of always being behind in life. And that's why saving a small amount of money can be emotionally worse than saving nothing at all, because that small amount activates loss aversion. You stop protecting that money as if it were too fragile to exist. You don't see it as a tool, you see it as something that could disappear at any moment. And that paralyzes you. You postpone important decisions. You avoid changes that could improve your life because you're afraid of touching what you've saved. You stay in bad situations out of fear of risking the little you've achieved. And without realizing it, the money that was supposed to give you options starts to imprison you. Maybe you've already lived this. You start saving, feel proud for a few days, and then fear takes over. You think about losing your job. You think about a health problem. You think about an unexpected expense. You think about everything that could go wrong, and your mind doesn't rest. You don't live in the present. You live trying to predict catastrophes. And the most ironic part is that even with money saved, you feel just as vulnerable as before. Sometimes even more, because now you're aware of the risk of losing something. What almost no one understands is that financial security doesn't start when you have some money. It starts when you reach an amount that changes how your mind works. An amount where money stops being an obsessive count and becomes a buffer against reality. An amount where small problems don't turn into emotional crises. An amount where you can breathe before deciding, think before acting. This amount isn't magical, but it exists. And for many ordinary people, living real life, paying rent, groceries, bills, and trying to survive, that amount is around 20,000 reais. Not because 20,000 solves your life. It doesn't. But because, for most people, that amount creates a safe distance between a problem and despair. A car repair doesn't destroy your month. A medical appointment doesn't turn into a tragedy. A late payment doesn't become an emotional collapse. For the first time, you feel that problems still exist, but they're smaller inside your head. And that changes everything. It changes how you work. It changes how you relate to people. It changes how you sleep. It changes how you see the future. Until you reach that point, though, the path is emotionally heavy because you go through the most ungrateful phase of all. The phase where you've already made an effort, already given things up, already changed habits, but still don't feel any security. That's where many people give up. That's where many people sabotage themselves. That's where many people spend everything at once. as if telling themselves, this isn't worth it, it's never enough, so forget it. It's not a lack of discipline. It's mental exhaustion. It's the feeling of running without getting anywhere. It's the feeling that the effort isn't being emotionally rewarded. And maybe you're tired of exactly that. Tired of trying to be responsible and not feeling relief. Tired of doing everything right and still living in fear. Tired of hearing that all you have to do is save money and everything gets better, when in your experience it only increased anxiety. And no one tells you this is part of the process. No one tells you there's a psychological turning point, not a financial one. A point where money stops being a stress trigger and starts being an organizer of your mind. When you understand this, you stop treating your savings like a trophy or a pretty number on a screen. You start treating it as a mental protection system. A system that exists to prevent small problems from stealing your emotional energy. Because the biggest cost of not having money isn't the late bill. It's mental wear and tear. It's the constant sense of alert. It's the brain always in threat mode. And a tired brain makes bad decisions, accepts bad things, settles for bad situations. Not because it wants to, but because it's too exhausted to think of alternatives. Reaching that point of security isn't about showing off. It's not about investing. It's not about becoming a finance expert. It's about stopping living in a state of emergency. It's about being able to look at a problem and think, okay, this sucks, but it's solvable. And when you get close to that threshold, something curious happens. You start making better decisions, not because you studied more, but because you can finally think calmly. You start seeing opportunities that used to go unnoticed. You start saying no to things that drain your energy. You start planning without that tight feeling in your chest. And that's exactly why the 20,000 isn't the end of the journey. It's the beginning of clarity. It doesn't make you rich, but it gives you back control. It doesn't eliminate problems, but it prevents them from dominating your life. It doesn't guarantee the future, but it takes you out of constant survival mode. And getting out of that mode changes everything. Absolutely everything. When you understand this logic, you stop blaming yourself for feeling anxious, even with some money saved. You realize you're not weak, not ungrateful, not irresponsible. You're just in an intermediate phase, emotionally difficult, that almost no one explains. A phase where the brain still doesn't feel safe enough to relax, but already feels the weight of having something to lose. And knowing that already brings some relief. Because now you understand that the discomfort doesn't mean you're on the wrong path. It means you haven't reached the turning point yet. And that turning point doesn't come from willpower. It comes from consistency and structure. It comes when you stop deciding everything while exhausted and start creating simple systems that work even when you have no energy. It comes when you understand that the goal of a reserve isn't to stop you from spending, but to stop small mistakes from becoming big damage. It comes when you stop treating money as morality and start treating it as logistics. And that is liberating. There's a quiet moment in almost everyone's financial life when a person starts earning a little more or spending a little less. And on paper, everything seems to be improving. The bills start to balance out. The credit card doesn't max out every month. The balance doesn't hit zero on payday. But internally, the feeling doesn't follow that improvement. On the contrary, the mind starts getting even noisier. You start overthinking every decision. You start reviewing past expenses, past choices, mistakes that already happened and can't be changed. Money starts carrying emotional memory. Every dollar saved carries the fear of losing everything again. That's when silent mistakes appear mistakes. No one calls mistakes because they look like responsible behavior. You start freezing. You postpone important decisions because it's not the right time yet. You stay in a job that drains you because you don't feel safe enough to try something else. You avoid investing in something that could improve your income because you're afraid of making a mistake. You start confusing prudence with paralysis. And the most dangerous part is that all of this happens while you believe you're being careful. On the outside, it looks like financial maturity. On the inside, it's pure fear. The brain, when it's below the safety threshold, works like an alarm that's too sensitive. Any noise becomes a threat. Any expense becomes danger. Any choice becomes risk. And this constant state of alert creates a very cruel illusion that the problem is always lack of money, when in reality, the problem is lack of margin. Emotional margin, mental margin. Margin to make mistakes without destroying everything. Without that margin, you don't live. You manage damage. You don't plan. You defend yourself. You don't grow. You avoid falling. And that's exactly why so many people make more money and still feel poor, because the mental pattern didn't change. The brain keeps operating as if any mistake were fatal. The person improves externally, but internally keeps living as if on the edge of collapse. And living like that is exhausting. Exhausting at a level that doesn't show up on any spreadsheet. Exhausting because every decision requires enormous effort. Exhausting because everything feels heavy. Exhausting because there is no psychological rest. In this scenario, a very common and rarely talked about behavior appears delayed financial self. It's not the obvious, impulsive splurging. It is more subtle. The person gets close to a meaningful amount, feels the internal pressure increase, and unconsciously creates a situation to spend it all. A necessary expense. A justifiable expense. An expense that brings immediate relief because it eliminates the fear of losing. Going back to zero, strangely, feels more comfortable than living with the risk of falling. The brain prefers a certainty of scarcity to the anxiety of possible loss. And when that happens, the person blames themselves, calls themselves irresponsible, says they'll never make it. But the problem was never lack of control. It was a lack of understanding of their own emotional functioning. No one taught that money messes with fear, identity, trauma, and survival. No one taught that before bringing freedom. It activates deep insecurities. No one taught that the intermediate phase is the most unstable of all. The turning point begins when you understand that you can't rely on willpower to get through this phase. Willpower fails when you're tired, and you've been tired for a long time. What works here isn't motivation. It's architecture. It's creating a financial system so simple and automatic that it works even when you're not okay, even when you're insecure, even when you doubt yourself. That means stopping making decisions all the time, stopping negotiating with yourself on every expense, stopping treating money as something that requires constant vigilance. Vigilance is exhausting. Systems protect it. When you automate what can be automated, you free up mental energy, and mental energy is the real asset in this phase. Not yield, not returns. It's the ability to think without panic. When your reserve starts growing within a system, not through daily effort, something slowly changes. You stop checking the balance every day. You stop doing mental math all the time. You start trusting the process, even without feeling full security yet. And that partial trust is already enough to reduce the noise in your head. Money starts leaving the center of your emotions. It stops being the protagonist of your life and becomes a supporting character. And that's a clear sign that you're approaching the threshold. As you get closer to that point, you notice something strange. Problems keep happening, but they no longer dominate your thoughts. You solve them and move on. Before, a small problem echoed for days. Now, it takes minutes. And that difference is huge because it's in that freed up mental space that life starts moving. You start thinking about possibilities, choices, the future, not a fantasy future, but a possible one. And when you finally cross that psychological threshold, there are no fireworks, new euphoria. What you feel is something much simpler and more powerful. Mental silence. Money stops shouting all the time. It's there, quietly doing its job, and you realize that financial security was never about not having problems. It was about not emotionally collapsing every time they appear. Actually, at that point, you understand that the reserve isn't meant to make you comfortable spending. It's meant to make you lucid when deciding. It doesn't exist to be used all the time, but to allow you to choose when to use it without desperation. It's not a prize. It's a buffer. A filter between you and the chaos of the real world. And it's here that many things start reorganizing themselves. Your relationship with work changes. You don't accept just anything out of fear. Your relationship with consumption changes. You buy less on impulse and more with intention. Your relationship with the future changes. You stop imagining only bad scenarios. Not because you became optimistic, but because now there's margin to deal with whatever comes. None of this happens all at once. It's gradual, almost imperceptible. But when you look back, you realize you moved from a constant state of tension to a state of presence, and that has no price. It doesn't show up on a statement. You can't show it to anyone, but it completely changes how you live. If you made it this far listening to all this, you've probably realized that money was never just about numbers. It was always about how you feel when you look at the future. And the real goal of this journey isn't to accumulate for the sake of accumulating. It's to regain the ability to live without constant fear. The first point that almost no one accepts is that the problem isn't spending wrong. It's spending without margin. When you live on the edge, any expense becomes an emotional event. It doesn't matter if it was a good or bad choice. The simple act of spending already triggers guilt, fear, and regret. And that creates a silent cycle. You try to control everything, exhaust yourself mentally, and at some point lose control precisely because you're too tired to keep policing yourself. Then comes shame, the promise that now it will be different, and the cycle restarts. Not because you didn't learn, but because the environment is still the same. Tight, tense, and with no room for error. That's why trying to organize your financial life without first creating margin is like trying to organize a house while it's on fire. You try to tidy up one thing or another, but urgency dominates everything. The mind can't operate in the long term when it feels constant threat. It just wants to put out today's fire. And while you're in that state, any method will feel too heavy. Any spreadsheet will feel like another demand. Any goal will sound like more proof that you're behind in life. What changes the game isn't starting to invest, or learning about interest, or finding the best bank. What changes the game is separating the money that protects you from chaos from the money that pays for life. While everything is mixed together, your mind never relaxes. Because every expense feels like an attack on your survival. When you separate functions, the brain understands boundaries. This money here isn't up for decision. It already has a job. It exists to protect. And when something has a clear function, it stops being emotional. This separation doesn't need to be sophisticated. It needs to be obvious, simple, almost boring. It's precisely the simplicity that brings relief. When you know there's an amount that doesn't enter the monthly discussion, that doesn't participate in internal negotiation, that doesn't depend on your mood. You drastically reduce the number of daily decisions, and fewer decisions mean less wear and tear. Less wear and tear means fewer mistakes. Not because of virtue, but because of avoided exhaustion. And here comes an uncomfortable truth. Those who try to be strong all the time end up weak at the wrong moment. Willpower is a scarce resource. It runs out at the end of the day, after a problem, after bad news, after a frustration. Systems don't. Systems keep working even when you're not okay. And that's what allows you to get through the intermediate phase without sabotaging yourself. Little by little, when this system starts running, something very important happens. Money stops being a judge of your competence as a person. You stop defining yourself by your balance. You stop using money as a thermometer of personal worth. Because now it's organized, predictable, without drama. And when money leaves that emotional place, you recover something that had been lost for a long time. Clarity. With clarity, you start realizing how much you were just reacting. Accepting situations that hurt you because you didn't see alternatives. Submitting to exhausting routines because you were afraid to take risks. Buying small rewards to numb bigger frustrations. None of that was lack of character or something. It was just someone trying to survive without emotional margin. And it's at this point that approaching the threshold starts to feel real. You still don't feel completely safe, but you're no longer panicking. You no longer check the balance compulsively. You no longer spiral mentally over every expense. Money starts taking up less space in your head. And when that happens, space opens up to think about things that had been dormant, change, learning, planning, rest. When you get close to that amount we talked about at the beginning, what changes isn't the number, it's the weight. Money stops feeling heavy. It's there, but it doesn't oppress you. It doesn't demand constant attention. It doesn't threaten you. It doesn't charge you. It simply exists. And that creates a new feeling for those who've never experienced it before. Internal stability, it's not euphoria. It's not excitement. It's solid ground. And with solid ground, you notice something curious. You start making fewer mistakes, not because you got smarter, but because you stop acting out of desperation. You start choosing better, not because you became an expert, but because you can wait. Waiting is a psychological luxury. Only those who aren't panicking can wait. Only those who aren't afraid can analyze. Only those who aren't just trying to survive can build. This is the real foundation of financial security. It's not the amount, it's the mental state it allows. Money becomes an organizer of your life, not a source of internal conflict. And when that happens, you understand why so many people say that after a certain point everything changes, but can never quite explain what What changes is invisible. It's internal. It's silence. It's space. The first thing you understand when you finally leave survival mode is that problems don't disappear. They keep coming. The difference is that now they don't hijack your mind. Before, any unexpected event took over everything: your mood, your sleep, your decisions. Now it occupies the space it deserves. No more, no less. And that is real financial maturity, not the kind sold in catchy phrases, but the kind born from the experience of someone who's been at the emotional limit. But there's a silent risk after you cross this threshold. The risk of thinking the battle is over. The risk of relaxing too much. The risk of forgetting what it was like to live without margin. And that's when many people slowly drift back into a state of tension without realizing it. Not because they lost everything at once, but because they started mixing protection money with day-to-day money again. They started using the reserve to ease discomforts that weren't emergencies. They started negotiating small exceptions with themselves. And small exceptions, when they become habits, erode exactly what gave you peace. Maintaining a sense of security doesn't require rigidity. It requires clarity. Clarity of function. This money exists to prevent you from going back to living in constant alert. It's not a prize. It's not a trophy. It's not an emotional escape valve. It's a boundary between you and despair. When that function is clear, you protect the reserve not out of fear, but out of respect for your own mental health. Another thing that changes deeply when you go through this process is how you deal with the future. Before, thinking about the future was de-stressing. It was always an exercise in anticipating problems. Now, thinking about the future becomes neutral. Sometimes even interesting. Not because everything is guaranteed, but because you trust your ability to deal with whatever comes. And that trust doesn't come from optimism. It comes from experience, from having already gone through difficulties without falling apart. Actually, at that point, you realize that the real gain wasn't the money accumulated, but the rebuilt identity. You stop seeing yourself as someone who's always behind, always playing catch up, always bad with money. You start seeing yourself as someone capable of organizing their own life, even without perfection. And that changes how you position yourself in the world, at work, in relationships, in daily choices. You start saying no more often without guilt. You start saying yes with more intention. You stop comparing yourself so much. You stop thinking everyone else is better off than you, because now you have something many people don't have, even earning more inner calm. And inner calm doesn't show up on social media, but it supports everything that matters. Maybe the most liberating realization of all is that you no longer need to fix your entire life at once. Before, the pressure was enormous to get everything right, because any mistake felt fatal. Now, you understand that life is made of adjustments, that making a mistake doesn't throw you into the abyss, that taking a step back doesn't erase the whole path. And that realization takes a huge weight off your shoulders. When you look back and remember how you felt before, you realize how tired you were. Not just physically, but mentally. Tired of overthinking, worrying too much, blaming yourself too much. And that exhaustion was the real enemy. Not the salary, not the cost of living, not the system. The enemy was living without emotional margin, without space to breathe. And that's why this rule of 20,000 was never about the number itself. For some people, it might be a little less. For others, a little more. The number changes. The concept doesn't. What matters is reaching that point where money stops being a constant threat and starts being a quiet support. A point where you can treat financial problems as logistics, not as personal tragedy. If you've made it this far, you already understand something. Many people go their whole lives without understanding. That financial security isn't a luxury. It's a foundation. It's the ground that allows you to build anything else. Without that ground, everything becomes excessive effort. With that ground, even hard days are easier to get through. This video wasn't meant to promise you wealth, shortcuts, or magical solutions. It was meant to give you back clarity, to show you that the discomfort you feel isn't failure, it's a phase, and that there's another side to this exhaustion, a side where the mind rests and decisions become simpler. If this made sense to you, if at any point you thought, this is me, leave a like now. Subscribe to the channel to keep this conversation going every day, and comment the word asterisk security below. If you made it to the end comment asterisk asterisk security asterisk asterisk. So I know you watched until the end and that this content really spoke to you.